Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Shanley Allen at the University of Kaiserslautern, Landau. Dr. Allen is professor of psycholinguistics in the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Kaiserslautern, Landau. Her research investigates how cross-linguistic differences in morphosyntactic structure affect first language development, universal and language-specific aspects of language, and the interaction and mutual influences of two languages of a bilingual or second language speaker. Her work employs a variety of methods, including naturalistic observation, elicited production, self-paced reading, and eye tracking. Her work focuses on the acquisition of morphosyntactic structures in Inuktitut Eskimo, discourse pragmatic effects on argument realization in Inuktitut and English, and the acquisition of speech and gesture related to motion events across languages such as Japanese, Turkish, and English. Dr. Allen also investigates cross-linguistic influence during sentence processing in Inuktitut English, German English, Spanish English, and Basque Spanish bilinguals. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Allen to talk to us about the documentation of child language in diverse communities. She's going to be talking to us about the Acquisition Sketch Project.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this good? Yeah, okay. All right, so thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here. I am really pleased to be able to speak to such an active group of people here and who are interested in language documentation and acquisition, etc. And to be able to tell you about the Acquisition Sketch Project. Okay. However, the slides won't advance. Okay. All right. And I want to begin by acknowledging all of the colleagues who have been involved with this project. It's been a big team effort, and a number of funding organizations have also supplied funding. All right. So in the field of language acquisition research, we have a number of different goals, but I think we can all agree that the top goal is that we want to understand how children learn language, and not just how one individual child or children speaking one language learn language, but how all children learn language, regardless of the language they're speaking. And in order to achieve this goal, we need data from a lot of different languages to understand what's really universal across different languages and different cultures. So true for all humans versus what is language specific or culture specific. But the problem, as has been made clear in our field in the last 5 years or so, is that research about language acquisition focuses primarily on about 2% of the world's languages, mostly English and other Indo-European languages. So we can see in this by now famous graph from Kidd and Garcia's article that this is all of the articles on language development published in the top 4 journals over the last 45 years, and about 55–65% of those are on English, the green section at the top, then a bunch on other Indo-European languages, and the purple section at the bottom is the articles on non-Indo-European languages, which is a very small percentage. And so without understanding how a much wider variety of languages is acquired, we're going to have a lot of trouble reaching this goal of understanding how all children learn language. And there's another issue that comes into play, the urgency of this. So there are around 7,000 languages spoken in the world, but about 3,000 of those are endangered or nearly extinct. Languages are dying every day. And so it's fairly urgent to record the acquisition of some of these languages if we want to ever know about them. So I'm obviously not the only one who thinks this. Here's a quote from Evans and Levinson that says this in a much flowerier way. To show how the child's mind can learn with approximately equal ease any one of a vast range of alternative systems calls for a diversified and strategic harnessing of linguistic diversity as the independent variable in studying language acquisition. Can different systems be acquired by the same learning strategies? Are learning rates really equivalent? Are some types of structure, in fact, easier to use? So those are some of the questions that should be guiding us. And here's a sense of the vast linguistic diversity in the world. So as I said before, there are more than 7,000 languages spoken in the world, more than 400 language families, and South Asian languages. You can see tons of dots in that South Asian area there. So there are lots of languages relevant to this conference for which we know very little about the acquisition. So the key question then is, if we want to achieve this goal, how can we tractably study the acquisition of minority and endangered languages in a way that responds to both the rapid endangerment and the need to widen the evidential base in the field? So people have taken a number of different approaches. I was just talking with Sudha about Sabine Stoll's approach, the active project that has strategically picked out maximally different languages from around the world and targeted acquisition there. Cliff Pye has focused on comparing languages within the same language family to look at microvariation. So there's a number of possible different approaches, but our approach is what we call the acquisition sketch. And this is represented in a special issue, an open special issue in Language Documentation and Conservation, which the cover of which is shown here. And so in the rest of today's talk, I want to tell you a little bit about this acquisition sketch approach. What are the cornerstones of that, the highlights, and also how I've implemented this in Inuktitut, and whether this is really a viable approach. Looking at acquisition with only 5 hours of data, does that really tell us something that we would find in a much larger data set? Okay, so some key features of the acquisition sketch. It is a sketch, so an overview of the trajectory of language acquisition. This name comes from the language documentation idea of a grammar sketch, where you have a short version of the grammar compared to the 600-page version. So this is a short version and an overview of grammatical development as compared to looking in depth in one particular structure. It's based on spontaneous language use in everyday context. So we suggest collecting language from just children playing in their homes or working in the garden or whatever's typical in your community. It covers the main age range for language development. So we suggest collecting data at ages 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4, which is the period over which lots of development happens, let's say, not all development, but it's a rich period for development. Our approach is representative-ish, I would say, in that we suggest collecting data from 2 children at each age, so at least not 1. And it's manageable in that we recommend doing this with 5 hours of data, so 1 hour at each age, 30 minutes per child. Collecting data is relatively straightforward, but transcribing and annotating data takes a lot of time. And even 5 hours is going to take you quite a lot of time, but should be much more manageable than 20 hours or 100 hours or whatever. It covers all of the main areas of language, so phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, and gesture. Covers child language and child-directed language, because a lot of work in recent years has shown how important it is to look at the input for a full understanding of the trajectory of acquisition. And by having a similar structure for all of the sketches, that will facilitate comparison across the different sketches, which is one thing that we need to understand how all children learn language. And our approach is also flexible depending on researcher interest and language focus. So we give pretty clear guidelines and highlights of things to focus on in each area, but you can extend that as you wish, depending on what's relevant for your language or your interest. And it's guided importantly by an acquisition sketch manual that the group of people that I showed on the first page have written together on the basis of our many years of experience. This project started really out of language documentation researchers who realized that there are lots of people doing language documentation work, writing grammars or whatever, who realize, oh, there are children acquiring this language. I'd like to study that, but I have no idea how to get started. And so this manual is intended as a step-by-step guide for those people to approach an acquisition project. Another target audience is there are more and more native speakers of a variety of languages who are doing graduate work in linguistics and would like to do an acquisition project on their native language, but are not at a university with someone who's used to doing acquisition work. And so this should also be a step-by-step manual for them. So that's our target audience, but of course anyone can use it. So this is our manual. It has two parts. The first part focuses on getting the corpus together and preparing it for analysis. And the second part focuses on writing the sketch itself. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each part. So the corpus section focuses on first structuring the corpus. So what children to get, their ages, the number of children, what characteristics to look for in those children, etc. Then some practical considerations like the recording setup, where should you record, in the house, outdoors, what sort of equipment should you use, all of those kinds of things. Then once you have the data, preparing the transcription, so segmenting the, we suggest collecting videotape, so segmenting the video to prepare for transcription, what sort of tiers should you use in your transcription, etc. And then the actual details of transcribing and translating and annotating the data. So one thing people often don't think about with children is that it's very hard to decipher their utterances, and how should you approach that? How many times should you listen to the utterance before you give up and go on? How much of your own interpretation should you bring into what you think they're trying to say? Those kinds of things. So that's all in the corpus part of the manual. Then in the acquisition sketch part, we have a section on the background that includes things like the setting, the number of speakers, the structure of the language, ethnotheories about language development, the multilingualism situation, because many of us are in settings where there's not only one language, but other languages spoken, and what effect does that have? How do you deal with that? And then the core of the sketch, first, the child-directed language. So we have sections for each of phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, and gesture, and then also interactions with the child and how do caregivers deal with errors. And then for child language, again, phonology, morphology, syntax, lexicon, and gesture. And then we have a section at the end about community report. So I didn't mention, but we feel very strongly that this work should be integrated within the community and done in partnership with the community, and that there should also be benefits to the community from this work that you should lay out from the beginning. And so in this community report section, then you talk about either what you've done together with the community or what you're planning to do or what possibilities would be, but something to indicate that the community is involved and benefiting from this work. Okay, so that's what is contained in the manual. And it's, of course, there's about, I don't know, 60, 70 pages in each part of the manual, lots of writing, but I want to give you just a snapshot of some of the kinds of things we include there. So there are obviously lots of guidelines and suggestions. This is an example of different data recording options that we offer. So on the bottom here, you can see that we suggest either collecting a day-long recording or 3 to 5 hours within the same week, or at minimum, at least 60 minutes from each child, but then processing, meaning translating, transcribing and translating and annotating, only 30 minutes for each child at the beginning for the sketch, and then you can always go back and do more. But for some of these languages, now is the only time when you're going to be able to collect the data, and you may as well collect as much as is feasible. But then if you try to analyze all of that, you'll still be here 100 years from now. So you have to make it tractable. Okay, so this just lays out different possibilities. We bring lots of examples from experience. So here on the left, we see the the recording set up for the Murunpata project in Aboriginal Australia, with having little backpacks on the back of the kids with the recording equipment in and where the microphone goes, etc. And on the right side, we see the tier set up from the Kaket project in Papua New Guinea. On the top, we see how one utterance would look like in Toolbox, which is the preferred method for language documenters, and on the bottom in the chat format, which is the preferred method for language acquisition people. And so you can just see, if you've never thought about how do you transcribe data before, this would be what it would look like. And you can choose between these or have another alternative. Then we offer key concepts from the literature. So we're assuming that most people doing an acquisition sketch won't have tons of background in language acquisition. In the manual, we provide what we think are key concepts and then literature that people can go to for more detail. But here's an example of the typical features of child-directed language that you might look for in your language. And then lots of questions to spark ideas. So people will be doing these sketches in a huge variety of different kinds of cultures and language typologies and ways of interacting with children, etc. So rather than saying, do this, do this, do this, we say, here's a range of things you could look for, see what makes sense for your language. So this is about routines in child caregiver interaction. And we ask, are there any salient routines when talking to children? Do adults prompt children as a means of teaching appropriate pragmatic behavior, things like say thank you or whatever? Are there other interactional routines like for soothing or comforting or distracting or entertaining children? Would those be interesting? Are there songs or chants or lullabies that are commonly used? So a number of different questions to make you think in different ways about what's going on in your community and what would be interesting to look at. And then we have summary boxes for each section. So as I said, we want to make this project tractable. So for each area of language, we have usually 3 things that we think are doable with this amount of data and are relevant for the acquisition field. And then other things that we think would be interesting to look at if you have more time or energy. So for child phonology, our questions are, what is the distribution of phonemes and tonemes and syllable structures across development? Do you observe any phonological processes? At which ages? Do you observe any pattern in the truncation of words? And then if you have more time, you could look at things like stress or prosody. So we try to focus on what we think are the key questions and then additional questions. And then we have lots of examples from our ongoing sketches. So this is an example, again, from the Kaket project in Papua New Guinea about the intonation in child-directed language. And so you see here, this is polar questions addressed on the left to a child and on the right to an adult. And you see that the pattern is quite different. The pitch is much higher in the question addressed to the child than to the adult. So this is an example of something you could do. And here are deictic gestures in Murunpata on the left from an adult and on the right from a child. And you see that both of them are pointing with the whole arm and whole hand and then the index finger extended. So that's quite different from what you would see in English, for example. So just some examples of what we've seen in our sketches so far and what you might be looking for in your language. Okay, we also have a webpage of resources hosted by the University in Cologne. So you see the homepage here. It has different sections and work in progress. As far as we know, there are about 12 sketches ongoing right now. Some from our team, but some from people that got interested and got grants for the work and now are pursuing it. And many more people are interested and starting to think about it. So this is our webpage, and we add material there regularly. We also have a YouTube channel with tutorials. So over the last 2 years, we've been doing Zoom tutorials every month going through the manual. We have 19 tutorials stepping through each part of the manual. And each one is about half an hour presentation of the material and then half an hour discussion with people that came to the tutorial. And so that is all available on the web page here. And on the YouTube page here. And we just started a couple of months ago a new round of Zoom sessions looking at ongoing sketches. So the first two were about Pitjantjatjara and Muranpata, two Australian Aboriginal languages. And the next one coming up on December 10 will be about Georgian. So that's a team of people that have nothing to do with us. They heard about the project, got a grant for it, and now are creating their own acquisition sketch. Super exciting. So that will be on December 10, if you're interested. Okay, so you can find all this material on the YouTube channel. And so this is what a sketch outline would look like if you were going to do it. So the first four parts there are what I mentioned under background, general information about the culture and the situation, language typology overview, the data about the focused children, other participants, how you recorded it, anything about multilingualism, and then the learning environment and ethnotheories. And then the child-directed language and child language, each with sections on phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, and gestures. And in the child-directed section, scaffolding techniques and responses to non-target-like utterances. And then the community report at the end. So this is the outline of what you would be producing. Okay, so at this point, you may be wondering a question like, does this really work? Can you actually learn anything useful from only 5 hours of data? And so in the next part of the talk, I want to tell you a bit about the sketch that I have written on Inuktitut and give you 3 examples of things we looked at in the sketch, and then with a much larger set of data to show what the relationship is between them. Okay, so there's one full sketch that's been written so far. It's on Inuktitut that I wrote together with a student. And Inuktitut is spoken in the far north of Canada, so basically the opposite of all of the languages you're dealing with. And here are some cities you might be familiar with. There's Boulder, and you can see that Inuktitut is spoken way, way far south, far north of Boulder. Inuktitut is a language of the Inuit Yupik Unangan family. There are about 34,000 speakers in Canada. And it is the first language in the region I work for almost 100% of the children, but in some other regions, a smaller percentage. Anyway, a language that's quite viable for acquisition work. What is the structure? This is a typical word in Inuktitut, so it's really long. It is what would represent a whole sentence in Inuktitut. So this word means, but also because I never went to the really big house. And you can see it has a lot of parts to it. So Inuktitut is a polysynthetic language. A full sentence is expressed within the word. It's agglutinative, so it has lots of individual morphemes, most of them having one meaning, except the inflections, which are portmanteau. And it can have up to 10 or more morphemes within a word. This word has 11 morphemes. Obviously, most words don't look like this. Most words are shorter, but still it can be quite complex. And there are 2 types of morphemes, as I mentioned. So inflections, there's about 400 different nominal endings marking case and also possession for the possessee and the possessor, person and number. And then there are about 750 different verbal endings, portmanteau morphemes marking verbal mood, and person and number of subject and object. And then there are word internal inflections marked here by green. There are about 400 different possible meaning units inside the word, some of which represent what would be lexical items in English, like verbs or adjectives, some of which are things like negation or tense or aspect, whatever. So if we look through this utterance, then we start with the noun house. And then we have the adjective big and the emphatic marker. Those are word internal morphemes. And then the case marker, the allative. And then the verb go, that turns the whole thing from a noun into a verb. That's typical of polysynthetic languages. And then past tense, perfective, negative markers. And then the verbal inflection, marking mood and first person subject. And then a couple of encodings. So it's the typical structure of a word in Inuktitut. So complicated for a child to learn. And importantly, we know very, very little about how children learn polysynthetic languages. And more, but still not tons, about how children learn agglutinative languages. And so it's crucial, if we want to understand acquisition of all language types, to look at more languages of this typology. And typology of all the languages you're looking at too. Okay, so this is the sketch data set. I took this from, I already had a much larger data set that I'd been working with for about 30 years. And when we started this sketch project, I extracted data from that to make a sketch corpus. And since I only had data going up to 3.5, I had to move the ages back about 6 months. So I have 1 year, 4 months, 1 year, 10 months, 2 years, 4 months, 2 years, 10 months, 3 years, 4 months. And then you see all the children here. Sarah is represented at 2 age points and Lizzie at 3 age points. And then the kids at the other age points are all 5 different kids. That wasn't really planned, but this is what we call a cross-legged structure. You could do it all longitudinal, like the same 2 children at each age point, or you could have 10 different children. If you just have 1 month to go in and collect all the data, then you just get completely cross-sectional, all different kids. There are their exact ages, so they can differ by 1 to 2 months from the target ages, and the number of utterances. And so you see that in half an hour of data, you can get, at least for the older ages, about 150 utterances. This obviously depends on the talkativeness of the child, but we recommend that you do this with talkative children because your goal is to get data, right? Maybe not so representative of all children, but at least you have data. Okay, so that's our sketch data set. And we looked at 3 different aspects. The first thing I'm going to talk about is mean length of utterance. So mean length of utterance, as you all know, is a standard measure of linguistic ability. It's used in many languages, usually measured in morphemes, but could be measured in words or syllables. It typically increases with age. There's some individual variation. And so here's a table showing on the y-axis, we have the mean length of utterance in morphemes, and on the x-axis, the age for one of the classic studies in English, showing that MLU increases with age, although there's some variability. So the question was, well, what would that look like in Inuktitut? And so here are the data that we got from the sketch. So the 5 ages are along the top. The 2 different children, not the same children, are under A and B, and the mean at the bottom there. And so what we can see is, first of all, there's enough data to see a clear pattern. At each age, there's between 70 and 400 utterances. So there's enough data that we can say, okay, this is believable. Also, the MLU in morphemes clearly increases with age, as we can see along the bottom there. There are some differences between children at a given age, which you'd expect. This is most clear at 2 years, 4 months, where they're almost 0.5 morphemes apart. And it's consistent with the pattern from other languages that we increase with age, and that the MLU is in morphemes is similar to the age. So at 2 years, 4 months, we have an MLU of about 2.4. That's what we typically find with a language like English, although it wouldn't need to be that. Okay, so we see from the sketch data that we see the kind of pattern that we'd probably expect. We also looked in quite a lot of detail at MLU with a larger set of data, 20 different data points taken across the same age range, and this is the result we found. This data was published in First Language in 2015. So 20 different points, and we see the same pattern. We see an increase over age, of MLU over age, and more variation between children, but the pattern that we see from the sketch data and the pattern we see from more data is very, very similar. So that gives us some way to think, the sketch data could give us results that we can believe. All right, my second case study comes from looking at demonstratives. These are words like this and that, this one and that one. So these have been studied also quite a bit in child language. They tend to emerge quite early because they're very frequent in the input and something kids want to talk about. But they tend to be mastered quite late because they require perspective shifting. So something like this is this for me, but that for you because it's far away from you. And kids have to figure out that perspective difference and what that means. Most systems, like the English one, are fairly simple and contrast near to speaker, like this, versus far from speaker, like that. So most of the literature focuses, the acquisition literature focuses on those kinds of systems. There are a couple of studies on more complex systems in Turkish and Spanish and Tikuna and Amazonian language. Inuktitut has a more complex demonstrative system that's different from all those other languages I just mentioned, in that it not only focuses on this and that, but also focuses on, I'll show you, so the distance from the speaker, but also the elevation above or below the speaker, and whether the thing is inside or outside a structure, and whether the thing is static or moving. So a lot of stuff to be keeping track of while you're choosing which form to use. And so we wondered, with a much more complex system like this, what would the kids do? And so I've highlighted una there, which is the equivalent of this or this one in English, because we predicted that's what the kids would use at the beginning. And then we wondered, when would they use all of these other forms, or would they even use them at all? So this is what we found with the sketch data. You see the near static una is the top line, and then all of the other demonstratives together are the second line, and the last line is the total number of demonstratives that we saw in our sketch data. So the first thing to note is that we see enough data to be able to believe we have a clear pattern. By the last 3 ages, we're seeing 50 demonstratives in the data, so that's quite a lot to see some pattern. And we also see that the near static una, meaning this one, is very early and the most frequent. So at the first 2 ages, that's the only demonstrative that we see, but even at the last 3 ages, it's more than 85% of the demonstratives. And then the other ones start coming in at 2 years, 4 months, and are much less frequent. What we don't see on this slide, although I think we looked at it a little bit in the sketches, which ones are coming in and etc. Anyway, we can see from the sketch data that the near speaker form emerges early, and that's similar to what we see from other languages. So we can see actually, quite a lot from the sketch data. So then for MLU and for the next structure, I'll show you passives. I had already done studies before we did the sketch. For this one, I had never looked at demonstratives before doing the sketch, and I thought, oh my goodness, what will I find with a larger set of data? So we actually did this with data from 100 hours, so 24,000 utterances, and saw a very, very similar pattern. So on these graphs, you see on the left the proximal form, so that una that we saw, this one, and on the right panel, all the other forms. And we see in purple the child pattern, and in green the mother pattern. And so we see basically the same pattern. So on the y-axis is the percentage of demonstratives that are percentage of the total demonstrative roots of each of the proximal and other. And on the x-axis is the MLU, not the age, but correlated. And so we see that at the beginning, the children are using almost 100% una, and then that decreases over time to about 75% by an MLU of 4, whereas the caregivers, mothers in this case, are using about 75% una across the board. So not surprising that children use a lot of una, because that's 75% of the input they receive. And then correspondingly, the other forms increase in children over time, and mothers are using about 25% of those other forms. And obviously in this paper, we go into a lot more detail of which forms and etc. But the important thing for us is that we see a very similar pattern in the sketch data and this data from 24,000 utterances. Okay, the final example I want to give you is from passives. So passives in English and many other languages like German and Spanish and whatever often emerge quite late, so around 4 to 9 years old. Languages with lots of passives in the input show earlier emergence, like Quiche and Sesotho and Zulu. So if you follow child language literature, this was a huge debate in the 80s and 90s. And yeah, central for the generative theories of language acquisition. Inuktitut has high input of passive. It's about 3 times what it is in English, and the structure of the passive is not very strange compared to other structures like it is in English. So we might predict then earlier acquisition in Inuktitut. And this table is from a paper I wrote a long time ago showing the number of passives per hour in English, so somewhere between 1 and 3, and about 3 times that amount in Inuktitut. Okay, so what would we see in the sketch data? Here we see the 5 groups across the top, and then short passives and full passives. And we see that there's not very much relevant data, but enough to show a pattern. So there's only 11 passives in the 1,166 utterances that we have. That's about 1% of the data. But nonetheless, we see some passives. And the full passive occurs. It's about, there's only 1 full passive, but that's about 9% of the total passives. So the fact that we even see a full passive in this data is surprising if you had only previously looked at English, where people say, oh, full passive doesn't come until 9 years old. Here we're seeing it at 210. And so we see that the passive is present from at least 2 years, 4 months. That's much earlier than you'd expect on the basis of English, German, French. And supports this idea that frequency determines the timing of emergence. So then here's data from passive, looking at about 21 hours of data in Inuktitut. There are about 6,300 utterances. And we find a very similar pattern to what we found in the sketch data. So here we have 66 total passives in these 6,000 utterances. That's again about 1% of the data. And there's 12 full passives, so that's 18% of the total amount of passives, but not 9%, but okay, within the same ballpark. And having more data obviously allows a much more detailed analysis. So in this paper, we go into detail about looking at productivity and the different verb types that passive is used with and the different frequency, etc. But important for us is that we saw the same basic pattern in the sketch data that we're seeing here with a much larger set of data. So obviously, I've only given you 3 snapshots. It's not that there's 3 others that I've hidden that don't show this pattern. We only have time for 3. But from this, I think we can see that the sketch data, while it's only a relatively small amount of data, nonetheless can tell us quite a lot about the general patterns that are very similar to what we see from a larger amount of data. So if we come back to our question, does this really work? Can you tell anything useful from only 5 hours of data? I would say that the answer is yes. So the sketch, I think, has its own contribution by itself for frequent phenomena and patterns with quite strong trends. We can see what the trend is. So for example, MLU, there's lots of data. You can see it increases with age. Or the near static demonstrative, we had 50 demonstratives per age group. We can see that it's early and frequent and what the patterns are. Also inflections, there's tons of inflections, so I could have showed you that as well. And it can provide support or contradiction for predictions from the literature. So we saw with the passive data that we can see already from the sketch data, it's unlikely that late passives are universal because we see them here already at 2.4, including more complex constructions. So the sketch itself then can contribute its own work. And it also can be extremely helpful for developing hypotheses for larger projects. So for less frequent phenomena with clear patterns, like demonstratives was pretty frequent, but we didn't see very many instances of the rarer demonstratives. And so, however, we could see that if we looked at a larger project, we would be likely to see something there. And maybe experiments would be useful to draw out those other kinds of demonstratives. For passives, we saw from the sketch data that was early acquisition, and we saw that it would likely be productive to look at this in a larger set of data. And for frequent phenomena with further potential, so the MLU, for example, it would be probably useful to look at the difference in MLU between morphemes and words. Maybe we could have done that with the sketch data too. And I wanted to mention, I was talking to someone yesterday who's developing MacArthur Communicative Development Inventory for Hindi. And who was that? Not here. Okay. Okay. And the sketch data is also very useful for something like that, because especially for Hindi, I know you have a lot of child language data, but I'm working, for example, right now with someone who's developing a CDI for Mongolian, and there's zero acquisition work on Mongolian. So he has no idea where to start, even though he's a native speaker. And so he's collecting data for an acquisition sketch. And from that, you can find what are all the typical words that children use, what kinds of errors do they produce, what might be interesting to include in the error analysis section of the CDI, etc. So if you are interested in developing assessment instruments for your language, or developing books for children or whatever, the acquisition sketch approach can give you lots of basic data that will help you get started with that and give a good foundation. Okay, yeah, and this is maybe what I just said. It can help you give a foundation for materials for community use. So MLU will tell you typical word and sentence lengths appropriate at different ages. Let's say you're developing curriculum material for daycares. Demonstratives, the information from the sketch could tell you what order to use demonstratives in your material, like static ones would come before dynamic ones, for example. For passives, we could see that there's no need to shy away from using passives in material for little kids because they're commonly used. Vocabulary can tell you typical words used at different ages. Word order, which I didn't tell you about, but we see from the sketch data that Inuktitut is a basic SVO language with flexible word order, but the kids up until 3-4 use almost only SV or OV, not any of the flexible word orders. So that's very interesting to know and could affect how you'd structure sentences in books for kids, for example. Okay, so lots of positive things, also some caveats. Children are quite variable, so what you get may depend on the children you select. You want them to be talkative, but you can't always select the perfect children. So someone was asking me yesterday, should I just select 2 children at each age? I would probably suggest having 4 children at each age, if that's possible for you, because recording data is easy to do, and then selecting from that which kids seem to be the most representative. And if you're trying for a longitudinal study, kids may drop out across time, so you want to start with more than just what you need. Data are also limited, as we saw, so you can't confirm the absence of phenomena with these data. You can't really show productivity for most structures. You can't do inferential statistics mostly to confirm generalizability because there just isn't enough data. It's easier to see patterns, of course, if you know what to look for. So I did the Inuktitut sketch with the benefit of 30 years of looking at various structures. If you don't know what to look for, it might be a bit harder, but you can think a lot about the features of your language and how they can address current debates or gaps in the field. And ask community members about typical strengths and difficulties that children have, and that can guide you. And the work is, of course, not trivial, even though it's only 5 hours of data. It still probably will take you about a year in total to collect and transcribe and analyze the data. So with the data already transcribed, translated, and annotated, and some background research done, my student wrote our acquisition sketch in 6 months. But if you're working with the language where there's no rating system, that will be very different. Or if there's no dictionary to divide morphemes and you have to figure that out yourself, of course, that will be different. And if you have people that are literate with computer to transcribe with you, then that will be different than if people aren't literate. So it's a bit difficult to say how long it will take, but definitely working with 5 hours is going to be much easier than 20 or 100 hours. Okay, so the take-home message, 5 hours of data in an acquisition sketch can contribute quite a lot. Useful descriptive findings for frequent phenomena, promising hypotheses for further research, support for community materials, broader understanding of the variation space in acquisition, and will serve to increase diversity in the field of language acquisition. So I strongly encourage you to consider creating an acquisition sketch for one of the many languages that you work on. Thank you. Okay. Do you want to come up and ask your question then, sounds like, so that people on Zoom can hear it? Okay.
There are many reactions on Zoom.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone on Zoom. Yeah. I don't know if you can see me, probably.
This was so incredible and made me miss doing developmental work. It's just so much fun working with kids, and this is a great reminder of that. I had a question about child-directed speech. So you had a comment towards the end saying that it's easier to see patterns if you know what you're looking for. And I was wondering, with child-directed speech, we already know there is some patterns that are kind of universal, so to speak, but there's also cross-cultural variation in the ways in which parents tune their input. And so when you don't know what to look for, which you wouldn't with a culture where it hasn't, you haven't quite documented that, what would it look like if you're only comparing it against the weird norms we have? Weird,
right.
Then, yeah, how do we know what we're missing? How do we go about figuring that out? Thank you.
Great, that's a great question. One thing I can point you to is an article that just came out in the Australian Journal of Linguistics, where we compare on the basis of acquisition sketch data what child-directed speech looks like in each of 5 languages, including Inuktitut, and measure against that table I showed you earlier. And so I think the answer is, from the point of view of the acquisition sketch, that we give you what we know from the literature so far, for example, that table, and a set of questions to think about, and the more comparative work we can do, like this article I just mentioned, that, and then you have to figure it out for yourself what's true in your own language. So I think what we contribute is a framework of things to look for and questions to ask and ways to be aware of your perspective. And there's more and more literature about, your specific question was about input. There's more and more literature about input in non-weird languages. So it would be ideal to have an overview article looking at all of those different languages. That might be a great thing for your dissertation. And yeah. Okay. Okay.
I think you can just change the view so we can.
Sure.
Can I ask my?
Sure.
Oh, okay. That was a great talk, Shanley. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I was wondering about the MLU as serving a measure for is it grammatical complexity? But there are other measures, right? Like mean verbal density. I've used this myself in comparing narratives told by children in 2 different languages, in English, and some of these also involved a diverse set of languages, including some South Asian languages. And I found that mean verbal density, which has been used by others as well, actually was very useful. Only one thing is that in many of the South Asian languages, we don't have this would just involve counting up the number of verbs, including main verbs as well as auxiliary verbs. and, and averaging them across the utterances. But of course, in many South Asian languages and also other languages like Korean and Japanese and so on, auxiliary verbs are suffixed, right, form. So we would actually have to count those auxiliaries in that way, that even if they are suffixes. So I found that to be a very useful measure, and I know others have used it as well. And one thing is that MLU can only help like up to a certain age, right? So in my study, we were looking at siblings across, so the youngest siblings were, let's say, 3-year-olds, and the older ones were like maybe 15. And that worked out nicely for us. And so I was wondering whether I see that all of these children are, like you said, about collecting data from 2 years or a little less than 3 years to 4, right? But then sometimes we also want to know about how other things are acquired a little later as well in the process, given that for English and English to other languages, European languages, some work has been done for older children as well. So I was wondering then about this measure then, whether MLU would serve.
Right. Okay. So, so several questions there, but the first one, is MLU the only measure to look at, and is it the best measure to use across languages, etc.? I mean, I think that's an excellent question. It is not the only measure to use. So mean verb density could be very interesting. I've also looked at mean length of verbs. There's a number of different measures you could use, and it depends on what your research questions are and what makes sense for your language. Also, mean length of utterance can be measured in morphemes or words or syllables. So we found for Inuktitut that measuring it in words didn't make sense, because the words like the one I showed you here, they're really long, and that's one word. So the word length doesn't really increase very much over time, but morpheme length increases and syllable length increases as well. That would be interesting to do for Inuktitut, because actually the writing system is syllabic, so you could just count the number of symbols produced. But in a language like Irish, for example, which has lots of fusion and changes in the word that are pronunciation based rather than morpheme based, then MLU in words makes much more sense. And something like mean verb density would probably also make a lot of sense. Another thing you talked about was the typology of the language. You mentioned the inflections that are, or the auxiliaries that are inflected in the language you work on. And so this highlights the idea that it's not really fair to compare MLU across languages, because each language has different kinds of things that are being counted in a morpheme. And so if you have an agglutinative language where every morpheme has one meaning, or a fusional language where every morpheme has like 5 meanings integrated into it, or a language that marks both the auxiliary verb and the main verb, each of those is going to result in different numbers of MLU or whatever. So it's not really fair to compare across languages. And then the last question I remember is, what about ages, if you want to look at older kids? So the literature on English typically says MLU isn't that valid until after about 4. I think largely because the complexity in English after 4 is not realized in morphemes, it's realized more in word order and things like relative clauses or passives or whatever. And you don't see that reflected in utterance length in morphemes anyway. And however, people, even in English, have used MLU much later. So Mabel Rice has a classic paper that uses MLU until age 9. And in the sketch, we have MLU for the input as well. So I think I haven't done any study on this that really looks at it, but I see no reason why not to use MLU at later ages. And I fully agree with you that 2 to 4 is not the only interesting age to look at. And especially if you're looking at work in schools, then you want to be looking at older children. The acquisition sketch project focuses on age 2 to 4 as a way to increase diversity in that early age range where development is happening very rapidly. But probably there's lots of the principles you could use for looking at older age kids, and definitely looking at acquisition in older age kids is also highly relevant to our understanding of language development. Okay, I hope that covers several of the things that you asked. Thanks very much, Usha. And it was great to see you last week at BUCLD, and then
Same here.
you're here too. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering if instead of child and caregiver scenario, if it was slightly changed to a play school setting where it's multiple children, will there be a difference because it's just children talking to children? Like, because the child directed speech in some sense will also be from a peer. So would that offer something different possibly? Like I was thinking along the lines of neologisms, but are children too young for that? Or do they do that? This is more of an open-ended, what would happen if is there a different, like, do you have any idea on that?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So great, that's a great question. So the first thing it makes me think is that to say there's one child and one caregiver and that's what we should be looking at is a very weird focus. In some cultures, that's how things are. In other cultures, that's definitely not how things are. And so in many of the ongoing sketches, so in Inuktitut, we looked at the child and just the mother, not all of the other interlocutors. We could have looked at, like in some recordings, the father was present, and a lot of them older siblings were present, or and other kids. But we decided, since it was the first one, just to restrict ourselves to the child and the mother. In some of the ongoing sketches, they're including all of the child surrounding speech from people. I don't know, I think some of them have said like age 10 and up, or like what counts as child directed versus just more child speech from other children. And the example you gave was more child speech from other children if it's in a daycare setting. So I would say that's certainly super interesting to look at. That's not the format that we've thought about for the acquisition sketch project, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to give you valuable acquisition data. So if that's what you're interested in, you should totally do that and use as much from the acquisition sketch project as is useful and interesting for you. That's not exactly the project we had in mind, but that doesn't mean it's a bad project in any way. So that could be super cool. Okay. Okay, another question?
Thank you. As a non-child language person, this was really instructive, and it makes me want to look at.
That's super.
So I have two possibly related questions. One is that age range between 2 and 4, is it, are you open to looking at meta-linguistic awareness? In particular, I've noticed in my interactions with children that age that the idea of what language is itself, that I'm speaking in this language or that language, also emerges around that time, at least. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned the multilingual settings are noted where they are, but I'm guessing that some of the productions that children make at this in multilingual contexts will be hybrid constructions and will reflect an influence of the other language. So is there a way to, adapt this approach to acknowledge that that sometimes there won't be a central language, but and to capture that?
Okay, both very good questions. So the first one about meta-linguistic awareness, sure. metalinguistic awareness is also super interesting. We didn't include it here because our focus is spontaneous speech data, and so it's not clear how much we can find out about metalinguistic awareness from spontaneous speech data without, for example, talking to the child, doing experiments, doing particular observational strategies, whatever. But if one finds out things about metalinguistic awareness, one could totally include that. And there's, of course, nothing to exclude that you would do additional studies in addition to this basic sketch data to find that out, because I agree it's super interesting. Then the other question was about multilingualism. So this is a question that we have thought a lot about, but don't have any concrete strategies for yet. Many of the settings that we looked at are indeed multilingual. So even Inuit kids, there's a lot of English and French in those communities. And by the time those kids are 8, they're going to be going to school in English or French, and most of the communities are bilingual. But it's still a setting where in the homes, things are mostly monolingual, and we also targeted particularly monolingual homes. But for many of the languages for which there are ongoing sketches now, that's not the case. There's much more bilingualism happening. And so we need to figure out how to deal with that. And so code switching, which you mentioned, is something that would definitely need to be part of that. And knowing which language you speak and what you speak when would need to be part of that. We don't yet have good strategies for it, but it's definitely on our list. So we're in the midst of writing a big grant application for a research unit where we would have 9 people developing sketches in different languages, and at least one of those would be in a bilingual setting where we start to look at exactly how would we come to terms with this in bilingual communities. So we recognize that as a real key need going forward, and are hopefully going to be addressing that soon. But any input you have would be very welcome.
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My question was mainly about the kind of cross-cultural sensitization you would expect researchers to maybe go through, especially when they want to document an acquisition sketch in a non-native language and they want to work with an Indigenous community, because I think you mentioned there were some studies on Indigenous communities in Australia. I don't remember.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and increasingly important in today's world. I mean, it's always been important, but the importance of it is heightened by the current discourse. So yes, people obviously need to be very sensitive to the cultural situation in which they're working, and there are many ways one can do this. So many universities offer fieldwork courses or cultural sensitization courses or whatever for people planning to work in those kinds of situations. The way that I did it was being an open and respectful person, and then living in a family where I was surrounded by the culture quite a lot, and was there within the context of the school board and introduced by someone who had done research there for a long time, and there had been researchers in that community before. So the community was more open to it than if you just came in from the outside with zero introduction. I think this is a very delicate situation, and yes, you need a certain kind of person to do this work and a certain kind of community to accept this work. So that's why I think one very positive direction forward is native speakers of these various languages from these communities who are now doing graduate work in linguistics, going back to their own communities and doing this work, because then they're part of the community, they know the culture and the language, they're not seen as outsiders. It still can be a problem because it still can be you hoity-toity person who left our culture and went off to the big city, and now you think you're bringing back all this knowledge and we're not good enough, blah, blah. I'm coming to think that there's never going to be a good situation that's perfect for doing this kind of work, and balancing what we're getting from it for scientific knowledge versus what's good for the community is a very difficult question, I would say, but super important. I'm guessing that all of you have much more experience with this than me, and probably have very useful things to say about that too. So.
Can we go, because the coffee break, so you're ready on. Give it time to get some coffee, but thank you so much again.
Thank you. And to everyone in Zoom, thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. And if you want more information about acquisition sketches, I'm very happy to talk to you now in person or on email or whatever. Thank you.